We're talking about abstract art. So obviously you would ask obvious question, what do you mean by abstract? So I want you to think of one word when you think of abstract, and that word is essence. So think of the essence of a thing. That's pretty much it. Now, there is a definition for abstract art, and there are some words that I want you to remember, and those words are, well, as we described abstract art, the general definition would be art that uses visual language, and that's very important for today. Visual language. And that visual language is composed of shape, form, color, line. I'll write those up in order as we move along. And all of this is to create a composition, very key word as well, which may exist with a degree of independence from visual references in the real world. We're like, whoa, what do you mean? So what this means is, if I'm going to paint a tree, it should look like a tree. This used to be the way. And don't get me wrong, it's still done this way. So it branches out from what always used to be realist, naturalist art into what became the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it all happened so fast. So very quickly, all the art history I'm going to do today, we went from not having pictures or photographs to all of a sudden having photographs, film, airplanes. So think about that 30 years between 1890 and 1920, where cities were full of cars and machines now. And just the way visual information was completely changed. Newspapers, you name it, even the beginnings of television. What was the use of painting now? So this is an artist named Piet Mondrian, and I want to show you this sequence. This goes back to about 19. Also, one major thing that I should mention, World War I. All of a sudden, the whole world is at war. So all these things, when you put them in context, make you think, wow, what is the purpose? What are we doing here as artists to see the real world and what that means? So we're looking at a tree. And of course, we've evolved from, well, how come a tree has purple in it when you use color? Well, it is the way post-impressionists did that. They began to use color freely. It's more about the way I feel, not so much about the way I see it or the way it really is. So this evolution took a couple of years. And we go from this image to here. Can you still see what happened? So there's a small evolution from here to here. Can you still recognize it as that previous image? Some of us might have a little trouble seeing this as a tree. And it's the beginnings of getting away from the real world, because now we're more focused on some of that visual language. So you're looking at line, you're looking at shapes, you're looking at use of color. One more, we go from here to here. So this evolution is taking place as he's really wondering, how can I really get to the essence of, in this case, a tree? I'm going back and forth so you can see how I got from here to here. Now, what I want to mention is, all of a sudden you're seeing what used to be our idea, our picture of a tree, is now becoming all these horizontal, vertical, curved lines with less and less touches of color here and there. And there's a little bit of juxtaposition between the lines. So even the space, that word, space, becomes whole new. What is space? Which parts of this image that I'm looking at are space? We go from there to here. So you see the minimizing of color. It becomes more monotone, monochromatic, with just shifts in, I can't even call it light, but you just call it light and dark because there's little lighter and darker color. One more, we go from here to this. And now you're beginning to see how these lines are becoming little shapes. And the shapes have independence in their color, and they're occupying a space. Moving along a little faster. Eventually it becomes this. And this is about 17 years later. So all the way to this, and what I want you to really see here is the evolution of that seeking the essence for kind of narrowing it down, focusing it to the most important elements. They all became vertical, horizontal lines of a certain length or degree. And he also minimized the colors to, what colors do you see here? Simple primaries: yellow, red, blue, and then, of course, black and white. But guess what? There's one more. He went even further to minimize and just play with the size of these shapes. And this is Piet Mondrian's contribution to abstraction. So I hope this is, like I said, not too much information, overwhelming. There are the 6 steps, minimize, there's a lot more in between. But so you could see and actually take a quick, just like I said, glimpse of how it's making sense from one stage to the next. And how the only thing I want you to really kind of do today is go to that, maybe just step 1. You don't have to go further than that. Step 1 would be perfect. Now, I don't want to confuse you with any other concepts that might be overwhelming, but here's one more. So I have a bunch of samples that I want to get out of the way. Here's one. This is more contemporary. I just kind of looked through the internet, actually did a simple contemporary abstract art. Some of them popped up in Pinterest and Etsy and all over the place. And I looked for more of the ones that would serve for this purpose. Just showing you, in this case, it made perfect sense. So we see black and white shapes, some lines that become a little bit wider, thicker, almost becoming forms. The question here is, do you recognize anything? Now, I'm going to say a word, and notice how that's going to change everything. It's a tree. So if you look at the black shape, you're looking down in sort of an angle perspective up at a tree with no leaves. So the branches of the tree, you go, oh, wow. This is how easy you could turn something into just simplified forms of simplified color into almost abstraction. So it's just taking something that exists in the real world and just applying some of that visual language that you're going to get very fluent in at the end of this series, hopefully, to do something like this. And there's more than that. This one is a little more obvious. I don't even have to say the word. Somehow I'm guessing you all see what we all see, which is, as humans, we have this perspective. So we see kind of a horizon line and sky. And it's, oh, look, I can even see some trees. But the truth is, it's just a big swat of gray, white, and black. Black that has more complex shapes that begin to give us the illusion of perspective, distance, and even trees. So even this could be on the brink, on the border of becoming abstraction. So if you could see that, very important, because you could take that road. So all of these that I'm showing you, here's one more. Bunch of geometric shapes. And they're stacked and arranged in a composition. Very important. It's going to be the word of the day pretty much. But if I say another word, some of you may not be able to unsee it that way. If whatever you saw here, once I say sailboats and on water, you might go, oh my gosh, yes, there it is. I see the bow. Oh, that's the bow. That's the sail. No, it isn't. It's now you putting your mental process into simple shapes. Yes, some are recognizable as triangles and, sharp angle triangle, whatever you want to name them, and patterns or rows of rhythms of shapes. And the most important thing is, what is it? Is it white on black or is it black shapes on white? So, that's interesting. That's going to deal with the concept of space. here's that question. Is this a white on black painting or a black on white painting? And all of a sudden we're thinking of zebras now, like a real close up of a zebra. So it is something like this. What is this? And it is just a balanced. Is it balanced? Another question. Composition of shapes of color arranged on a canvas. Now this brings us to one more, which is texture. So let me go back just a little bit and add some of these words that we've been talking about all along. So the visual language has to have these elements. Line. Lines make shapes. Shapes become forms. Now those forms can be black or white or have color. But whether it's black or white, that's considered as a color, because there's the shades of whites and shades of black that can affect and have that sense of color. Just add a little light here. So we have shape, form, shape, line, shape, form, color. Then we're going to go into texture. Space. And so far, so good. So right here, we're at texture. And this is a close-up of what we're going to be doing today. Am I going to play with line? Am I going to actually build up lines and then shapes? Ooh, am I more adventurous? I'm going to play with some forms. I am going to minimize you in the sense of color because today is going to be all black and white. But you're going to have absolute freedom to discover and see how far you can take texture. Now, you may want it super slick and, uniform where you don't see any texture, or you could go extreme, and everything in between is valid. So here we are. This is another type of texture where you actually see a little bit of kind of background to it. This is a more generalized texture where you actually read it more as brush stroke. And those are two different things. Brush stroke can create texture, but you can also do texture techniques that are not necessarily brush strokes. I hope you're still with me. We're almost done. Now, here's again another reading of whether we have a balanced composition of shapes, or you might even consider that some of these forms. What is the difference? Difference is shapes are two-dimensional, forms are three-dimensional. That's about it. So when you begin to see space and perspective or volume, you're dealing with forms. So here you kind of read a little bit of space. I myself read the black as the subject and the white as the space, if you agree. And it's amazing how your brain can just switch it over and do the opposite. You could see the white as the subject, and then the black is the space. And it is that kind of reading that we're going to do. So here's one more thing I wanted to introduce today. If I were to use a word like I did earlier with tree or sailboats, what word would I come up with here? What if I used the word structure or balance? How would you visualize that? How would you interpret that? Generally speaking, we've had a tradition where if I said love or motherhood, or we would use people to represent that feeling. Here, you can get away from that, and it becomes more of a conceptual take on the meaning of it. So if you looked at this and you can come up with a word, forget about the one I said, but you feel something. And the idea is that abstract art should connect with you in a way that's going to make you feel like this, or it could make you feel like this. Now, if I said balance here, some of you might go, wait, what? What kind of balance are you talking about? There's too much energy here. There's too much action and movement. There's chaos. or maybe even some of us might see it as violence, and it becomes something else that we might recognize but can represent with images. So that's also very important. But when you bring it all the way back to what's important, we're looking at, what is it? Spatter, shapes, forms, lines, in this case, really just gestured, splattered on. But you could see the action. You can begin to see the energy of the artist's hand, and you could actually retrace some of, it was going this way first, and then it went just in this sort of bow action down here. And I know he did this one first because this one goes over. So there's a retracing of the action of it. And that actually has a name. It's action painting. Even more intricate, more conceptual. What are we beginning to read in here? So again, it's taking you into a new realm of emotional. All of these samples, what I'm doing now is hoping to tap into your inspiration. Some of these are going to be more connected to you than others. And maybe it's this one. Ooh, that's kind of my personality. That really connects with a feeling that makes me feel good. Maybe it's very close. Notice how these two could be considered cousins, but this one has something else. So whether you're here or here, you begin to recognize that what you're doing is exploring more about you and what's inside of you. Meaning in terms of concepts, what you think and how you feel. It could get a little more direct, just a simple shape, a circle, and we are the ones that attach meaning to it. But again, you get back to here. It's a shape, and there's texture, and in that texture, I see drip, and I see, other techniques. So you begin to read into that. Comparison between this one and this one. What's more important? Is the black on the white with that drip, or is the white on black that makes more of a statement for me? Notice here, this example, how you can also have space between your subject and space, whether it's black and white. You have some of the background that also plays a part in it. And we can do that. We're going to be doing that not this week, but next week, where you can add a wash to your background and start from there. Couple more examples. Mixing shape and line. Also, the space between the lines becomes very important as they get closer and closer, thinner or thicker and more separate from each other. Here's one of my favorites. Robert Reitman, very famous abstract artist. These are actually very small, and they're about the size we're going to be working today. And if you look at this, you would say, well, it's just white, little, almost looks like toothpaste. He did it with a toothpaste tube, just squeezing it on there. But these types of brush strokes, and his work is completely white, but it's tons of shades of whites that when you put one next to the other, you see the difference. And this is a close-up, is all about how you apply the paint on there. It's about the brush stroke. So it's giving the paint kind of this iconic primary, it's about how paint works. And it's about what paint can do. And it's kind of letting paint be itself. And you're kind of like just helping it get there. Notice here he has a little bit of that background play as well. And it could be black. I know it's a little bit bluish, but it could be black with the play of layers, creating that space that we're looking for with just simple brush strokes. And here's two more where the shape contains the entire canvas and trying to create that composition. And one more where it's more organic or geometric. So all of these options that I just presented, I am hoping that you can actually have a recalling of, wow, there were one or a few of these that I kind of caught my attention and that I liked. And I kind of really want to play with that. So the idea next is this. Remembering always our priority, I'm going to call it, to develop a visual language that is yours and only yours. And I always say this, we all speak English. Some of us can actually speak Spanish or French and German and all these other languages. No matter what language or dialect or accent you have, it's the way you speak, what you say and how you say it that really matters. And that makes you, that we can recognize it's you. Just by your tone of voice, your softness, or your pitch, or your volume, or the way you use your words and your selection of those words, you're going to be doing the same exact thing here. And the language you're going to be using now is lines, like I mentioned, lines that are very nice and slow or very energetic. Shapes, again, your approach to how you build those shapes is going to be that same volume, pitch, tone, and choice of words to develop. Kind of think about it, how you choose your words, how you choose the letters to pick those words, how you put those words together in a sentence, in a paragraph, and then we get to actually get the entire idea. And it could be just one word, it could be an entire book. It's going to take all of these, or most of these in some way, to come together to that. So what I want to do first, we're going to do this for just a few minutes, because today it's going to be mostly about getting this out of the way. We are going to be working in black and white. So if you have some sketch paper, and I'm going to be using a marker, you could use a pencil. Now, pencil's not going to be the best. I hope you have some, even printer paper. This is kind of the sketchbook paper. What I want you to do is, if you have a small little dish, container, where you can put a little bit, just a tiny little dab of acrylic paint, in this case black, and I'm just going to start over a new batch here, just a tiny bit. And I'm going to add just a little bit of water. So I'm going to pick somewhat of a medium to small brush. This is a round number 6. And I'm going to add a little bit of water, just here, a little bit off camera. So a couple of drops of water, 2 or 3 drops, maybe 4. And then I'm going to kind of mix that in, making it a little more fluid, just a little more loose. So I'm playing with the consistency of my paint, and it's becoming almost, what I want it to be like is ink. And you could do this with ink if you have it at hand. But because we're working with acrylic, I want you to kind of begin to get a sense of what you can do with the fluidity of your paint, because that's also very important to create those textures. Now, if you don't have a container like this, you could just go ahead and do it on your palette, but it might get a little spread out and messy because it's going to be so liquid. And what I want you to do is this. I'm going to add a little bit more water. You definitely want to have a paper towel at hand, just to prevent any mess. Just adding straight from my well. A couple more drops of water, about 5 or 6 of them. And just go ahead and mix that in. The more space you have for this, the better. You're going to want to do this. And these little plastic containers, once you begin to work a little bit larger and you do bigger brushes, you're going to want to have, your setup is going to be very important to how you start painting. If you're going to be one of these action painters, notice that you might, get paint here and there on your table, or hopefully not on furniture or curtains or walls, but it might drip, and to the floor. So you want to make sure you're set up and think about how you're going to be using it. Okay, so I have just enough. next thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and take this area of the page, just a piece of paper here, and I'm just going to go ahead and make a big rectangle. I could do this just about the same size of canvas that I'm going to be using today, or I could even make them smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and do four of them. Now, I did have 2 words of inspiration that I wanted to just throw out there today to see if that would help you. But again, this is such a personal approach to art that I don't want to kind of constrict you. The only let's call it a rule that I was going to use today is you're only going to be allowed to use black and white. Now, black and white, when mixed, makes gray. And it makes tons of different gray. We're going to get there in a second. So obviously that's going to play a part in it. But what I wanted you to think about is these 2 words, balance and contrast. So just keep those 2 words in mind if it helps you. What do I do? If you're asking the question, where do I start? What do I do? How do I start anywhere? What can I think about? I mentioned trees. You could think cat. You could think whatever makes you think. When I say the word balance, I want you to get to the essence of it. So balance, all I'm thinking is of a blank square, and without me having to represent images that would symbolize the word balance, I want to have that in my mind, just thinking about balance. Now, balance for me, I could start with, I'm going to go ahead and pick the first one, line. So I'm going to think of the word balance, and I'm going to also think of the word contrast simultaneously. And I could do it very easily. I could do 1, 2, 3 lines, and at the same time, I'm kind of playing with, like I said, the consistency of my paint, maybe some textures. So I'm thinking 3 lines here, and I'm going to go ahead and put 3 shapes down here. This one's a little bit smaller. And as I begin to fill, and I'm going to just add 1 more right down the middle. And in a way, you kind of want to get inside your head and let that very difficult to actually use language, words, speak as I'm trying to think of essence. And in a way, do I have to fill up my space? How far do I need to take these elements? And I feel like for my taste, I'm being a little too organized here. So I might want to be a little more, in this case, I'm being a little kind of geometric, more kind of mathematical approach to it. But it's just, again, in a way, kind of doodling. So what we're doing is we're working with some sketches or some thumbnails would be the name for this. Not completely in love with this. And that's fine. You can always just walk away from it until you begin to find something that is going to work for you. Now, that one is a little too, way too, how can I call it? I guess I'm thinking of the word mathematical, like almost trying to put together an equation and balance it out. So that's not what I was looking for. I'm going to go 1 more with line. And I'm thinking about line, and I'm going to do it more kind of the way I actually do my work. And I'm just really blanking out here, where it almost becomes subconscious and automatic. Notice that I'm creating a little bit of juxtaposition. And maybe now I can get a sense of developing a little bit of shapes. Notice that first I had all lines. Now I'm going to create shapes and space by filling in some of these areas here. And let me see, I could do something right here. Again, thinking about balance and what that means to you. And contrast is going to be a little bit easier because black and white would be the first thing I think about when thinking about the word contrast. Now you're going to be aware of all the parts of your blank canvas here. Now, am I working all the way down in the end here, leaving empty areas? And is that working? Is that still in balance? Now, this might be a little too organic. Let's go for one more. There's one where you're using gesture. So you might want to switch over to a bigger brush. And this is an example of sort of the break between line and shape, where you actually read more what I mentioned as the brush stroke. So that was just a drag with a brush full of paint, creating a brush stroke. And of course, there's that action that is hard to replicate that can make interesting. And in a way, you kind of want to explore some of this looseness very delicately without going beyond that point of balance. So between this one, and this one, I'm going lots more over here than over here. What else can we think of when we think of line, shapes, form, texture? Well, I'm going to think one where it's really about texture. For that one, I might come over to this camera here. See if I can show you closer. Just really quick. Here we are. So what I want to show you here is this, where I could try to develop, right there, just texture. So as I lay down brush, and I'm going to, remember, I added some water, so it's a little more liquid, but I could do this with different types of mediums, and as I get different applications with brush, or I was going to mention other tools. For example, a palette knife. I'm trying to add very thick, in this case, brushstroke shapes, because they are somewhat still kind of in the early stages of forms, of shapes. And the question always is, where am I going? What am I considering? And can I consider all of these elements simultaneously? And the most important one, contrast and balance. As I add more and more, how far is too far? And how quick? Avoiding to get there, because there is one of those things where there is a point of no return. So I hope you could see some of that volume, some of that brush stroke that I just added there. And as I go here, now I'm faced with another, and I'm going to do a little bit of contrast by adding more water and maybe just washing some of that in. And there's nothing that gets more personal than this. And I'm just going to create spaces of white between those shapes with that really watered down, but a sense of total freedom from ideas, not ideas, but the concept of what you have to represent. And again, you can start off like I showed you Mondrian early on with whether it's trees or sailboats or even portraits, believe it or not. Um, and as you move along the elements of the visual language, developing something that frees you from the image. So this one's getting a little bit more saturated in terms of what I'm doing to the space. Notice that I'm filling it up kind of like a complete background where there's going to be some contrast between that and almost like a halo around some of these shapes. And at some point, some of you might say, I recognize that as beans in a pot, maybe, and that happens. That's what we do as humans. We look for meaning, or even in a cloud. Oh, look, there's a bunny, or a dragon, an alligator. So always looking for the meaning in a form, in a shape. So as we put lots of combinations of line, shape, forms, texture, and combine that with the space they occupy within your canvas is going to be the key. That is what we're going to be looking for today. Now, next thing that I want you to do is continue working with your sketches. But what we're going to do next, as you continue working on your thumbnails, no rush. I'm going to move over to how acrylic works just a little bit. And for this, I'm going to bring out my palette. And I use a paper palette, but with acrylic, these acrylic, they're so easy to clean. They respond very well. Sometimes the one thing that doesn't work well on these is this. It scrapes and it smears. Wooden ones don't clean as easy, and you have to do it fast, like right after, otherwise it'll settle in. So as I think of, and I'm going to be working on a canvas today that is 8 by 10. I have black and white acrylic. I did not put it in the recommended. I have some brushes, flat and round, and they're on the smaller size because of the format. But I might go to a little bit bigger one. You could do that. Finish one of these paintings in just a few brush strokes. This, I may have mentioned before, these are mediums, acrylic mediums. So you have all kinds of different ones. And the reason I don't recommend these is because you have to search them out. Just like your voice, your way of speaking, you're going to have things that attract your attention more. So whether it's satin or matte or glossy, it's a matter of personal taste. Whether it's thinner, more liquid, or thicker and pastier, these are vehicles that when added to acrylic give you infinite, and I mean infinite possibilities for textures. So the more you explore acrylic painting, you're going to have to look at acrylic mediums. And there's tons of references, videos online from the actual companies, no matter what you're using. I use Golden. It's really good, but most brands have their own catalogs, web information on their website, and good samples that you can actually look at references to see what kind of textures and different looks you can create for pouring, for you name it, they have it. So this is one of the ones I use the most, just to give a little more fluidity and a little bit of that gloss transparency to it. So that's going to be something I use today. But if you don't have it, that's fine. Water is what you want. Now, these acrylics, as I set them up on my palette, I don't want to let them sit there too long. They're going to be a little thick. They're going to start drying up. So I want to make sure I have kind of, after looking at my thumbnails, after kind of playing around for a while, letting that idea simmer in my mind and saying, got it. Okay, I want to work with this. It's a different type of approach too, where you could just go at it right away. But the one thing I want to consider first is this. Am I going to work on a white background and add the black? Or do I want to add a black background and then work with white paint on black? Huge question, because that is the way you set up your painting. So what I'm going to do first, for those who may consider it, I am going to add a black background to it. Again, this is all from here on out. It's your considerations for the idea that you've been considering from your sketches onto your canvas. Let's see, this one's a little bit. Let's get the new one. And this is a carbon black. I'm just going to, matter of fact, I can literally just add it because I'm going to be using it on my canvas. I could literally just add it right on my canvas. Now the amount of it is going to be, you see there, it's like twice as much. The toothpaste, I generally use that. It's twice the amount of toothpaste I would put on my toothbrush, just about, for a size like this. And I am going to add a little bit of this medium. Now you could go with water, and I will do that as well. Just going to add a little bit of medium. And with this flat brush, I'm literally just going to start off by giving myself a nice solid background. And how far to the edges? Is it going to be a solid one? And I want to show you one of these techniques that I'm going to be using that begins to play with more the concept of space. So I'm thinking a little more space, overall space, before I do anything else. So I'm considering my background as the main focal point for now. And as I bring lines or shapes on top of this, I'm going to feel it's going to get me closer to where I want to be in the end. So one of these things here that I'm going to do is I'm going to get a little more water, get some of that paint off my brush, and hopefully you could see this. I'm going to bring in more water here, and notice what happens here. As I lift this from, let's see if you can see it better in this camera here. As you look, there we are. I could actually just lift, and I'm using a paper towel here to lift some of that pigment off. And actually create, see if you could see it there better without the reflection of the light, like this or like this. So there you go. So you begin to see, ooh, interesting variations in the space. And I did this just by literally wiping down what was already there on the first pass of my background. And I don't want to wipe the whole thing down, but I'm taking off about 70-80% of it. And I might consider at this stage using Can you see that? Let me try this. I have this lighting system here that might, I rebuilt it just for that. There you go. So as I take a little bit of that gloss away, there we go. So I didn't do this with a brush. I did this with a paper towel. And if this begins to look interesting to me, see it here, like this, I'm going to want to use some of that. Now, you could have done this with a brush. You could have done it with a paper towel. You could have done it with plastic, other tools. This is one that I use a lot, which is a palette knife. And you can literally just scrape paint on or off. And you're going to get a different type of pattern, a different type of technique, a different type of look. So there we go. And we are going to have to wait just a few minutes for this to dry. But while I do that, I can begin to think about what other, in terms of setup, I'm going to be needing for the elements that I'm going to add to this. So in terms of line or shape, I know I'm going to be working with white. Now here's one for some of you who want to think about this for a second. What if I were to use no white at all, just black on black? You can definitely do that. I showed you Robert Reitman's work where it's white on white, and you see those. Let me go ahead and put it back on screen. See if I can show you this one. So I know it doesn't say much, but if you're interested in texture, brush stroke, imagine this instead of white on white. Imagine it black on black. So that's a possibility, and this could be really interesting. And it would read completely different, of course, but it could be a possibility where I'm not bringing any white at all into my painting, and it still has that contrast and balance, but in this case, it would be much, much darker. So that's a way of thinking about it as well. How can I do that, play with that idea, and have it work out? So let's give it another second here as I take a pass with some more water and lighten some of these areas here. So I'm just taking this brush, dip it in water, and as you can see here, I take some of that pigment off onto my paper towel, rinse it again, and I don't want to overdo any of these at any stage. I want to be cautious of my thought process. What am I thinking about in terms of planning or strategy? Do I have a final vision, or am I just waiting to be surprised by what acrylic paint can do? And that is another completely logical way of going about it. You want to allow the paint to kind of be free on the canvas with you having just a bit of control and being allow yourself to be surprised. So I'm adding lots of water, more and more, because I'm liking how this brush, and I hope you can see it here. Let's see one more attempt at this. So you see how as I rush, it picks up some, it creates a new sort of texture, and at the same time, somewhat of a reading of space that looks very interesting. And it's also playing with that early on paper towel swipe imagery that I put on there as well. Lifting it up so you can see a little bit better. So you see how there's the white of the background coming through, which more and more tempts me. I guess I'll have to do another one, but that black on black idea. I'm going to have to play with it. I didn't really think about it. As I came in today to show you contrast, balance, I had it in my mind that it was going to be white on black or black on white and have it work out. So now, as I lift this, notice how there's some drip. Can you see it? As I lift it up, because the water, and now it's dripping. So I could also play with gravity. And as I flip it over, it drips back the other way. I could actually manipulate that drip and have it swing one way or another. So now it starts looking like there's water or wind influence in there. So overall, what's the main takeaway today? The idea for you to do this and do it in the right way is for you to feel like a little kid. To really allow yourself to free your mind from concepts overall in the process of actually, as you come into it, thinking of representing, having to represent something and allowing yourself to play more with paint, lines, color, shapes, textures is the key word today also. So it's more and more for me, textures. Maybe I'll in the end, I'll want to do some line shape kind of work here. But already this is saying something very interesting to me. Can you see that? So it was added, just adding a little bit of pigment to the background. And you could have done this with white just as well. Or maybe a little toned white, which was a very, very light gray. So many things that I could show you. The one thing I did not want to do today is tell you, do what I'm going to do and do it how I do it. The idea is to open up the infinity of possibilities. And the truth is, it's infinity times infinity times infinity 7 times, because the infinity of possibilities with line, plus the infinity of shapes, plus the infinities of textures, when you combine those and you realize that you are the one picking which ones, it's just astonishing. It's amazing to think about. And the next thing is how you think yourself through it that is important. And my biggest recommendation is just make it fun. Now, sometimes making it fun means being a little messier. So let yourself kind of, again, cautious, but allow yourself to kind of almost make a mess. It gets you closer. And again, as a kid, we didn't really care much about making a mess. And it is the one thing that might get you closest, fastest to that thing you like. Okay, so I'm still waiting for this to dry just a little bit more. And I do have kind of ideas of what's going to happen next as I bring in some white, and I'm going to mix in some gray as well. So I might set this aside for a second. I don't want to set up my paint too early on because it'll dry, but I am going to set this aside for just a minute. Let it dry. One last look. And I hope you could see that, how that's coming together. Now, some of you, like I said, might be more polished, more finished, glossy looks. All of it is open for play, basically. So I'm going to mix some colors here because this is going to make today a lot easier. I'm going to add just a dab of black. I'm going to consider how much paint am I going to need to apply on top of this. I am thinking about a lot of texture. So just to show you again, I'm going more for this kind of look. If I could show you this. Yeah, this one here. So my dabs of paint are going to be thick, and they're going to kind of layer on top of each other. And I'm going to allow the black background to just kind of be able to see it through these heavy brush strokes. Tempted to do something like this. Obviously, it would be opposite, where the white, here's the background, having the black be the opposite would be interesting. So I'm still considering some of that line shape, but not as defined as we see in some of these. Some of you, again, remember, this is just a refresher as we think about the next stage, where I might be closer to this option now that I started with my canvas having a black background. So this instead of this, but for some of you, this would be perfect. How far can you take a circle on a white background and develop line, texture, shape, or space with it? Even more so, how, as I develop something like this, can have a sense of balance. Definitely you have contrast. How do I develop balance? So all these, once again, just to help you maybe have a starter idea and then go from there. So I know there will be lots of white. That's a general rule. When we go with white, we use on acrylic and oil painting and all of them, you want to have twice as much white as you do black. You're going to use it a lot more. And you will see that. And I'm going to make a selection here of this tool, but I do actually mix better on this palette with a brush. You want to be careful with that. But what I am going to do is I'm going to take a chunk of this white, and I'm going to mix kind of a halfway gray. So I'm taking pure white, pure black, and I'm just going to add a touch of black. And by a touch, I mean, I want to show you here. This much. I could actually consider that too much. So as you see me here, where are we? Right here. So as you see me here, you can see how much black I took. That might be too much to add to this area here. So I might take a little bit, half of that off, and I'm going to start with just this very thin. Just dabbed it in and see how that goes. And notice that once I begin mixing, immediately I have a nice off-white. So this was too much white for that little bit of black, but it's always best to start on the lighter side of things, knowing, see, there's going to be a little more grayish coming up there as I let it all mix in. I hope you could tell the difference. It's a little bit tricky with the lighting, but you can definitely begin to see how what used to be pure white has a tone to it now. Can you see that? I could use this as one of my grays, but I still feel it's a little too light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 2 or 3 variations of it. And what am I planning? I'm going to have 2 or 3 levels of value as I apply my brush strokes. So I'm going to have maybe some black brush strokes on the background. On top of the black background, I'm going to have pure black. And I'm going to go a little bit lighter to more of a medium gray through this very light gray, and then finish up with some light, all white brush strokes. But I'm having a sense that they're going to be heavy. So it's going to be there's going to be a lot of room for play with that. So let me go ahead and set up some more. Keep this clean. I'm going to have another chunk of it, half of it. I'm going to set it up over here. So the way you set up your palette too is going to be very important. So I'm going to clean this up just a little bit. And one thing you do not want to do is have your acrylic flat and spread out, because it will dry very fast. And it won't reactivate as easy. So right here I'm running a risk. I'm still waiting for this to dry, and as I see it, it is drying pretty fast. I'm going to wipe up some of this, and I'm going to grab twice as much black as I did last time. Now again, favoring the lesser, going for a little bit less, but you can see how much I'm putting on there, right there. Let me see if I give you an angle view right on top of the white so you could see it. A little bit better. There we go. So this would be twice as much. Maybe there's a little bit less white. So you're noticeably going to see how much darker this gray is going to be. So in my head, I have more of a play of light and space. I'm thinking of brush strokes. So what I'm visualizing is going to be a more loose, just brush strokes all over my canvas in variations of value. Black, gray, white. And see how it goes. So I could say I'm taking my inspiration from definitely one of those Robert Reitman paintings. And there you see it. So this, now this and this are way off. So this needs to be a little bit pumped up. I'm going to take just a little bit of this gray from right here and add it to this mixture. And you want to be careful here. You want to, this setting up your colors in acrylic, in all painting, very, very important. It's a very patient part of the process, but so important. There we go. Now I have a bump. I like to call it a bump between these colors. So you could easily see that this one's way lighter than this one. This one's darker, but this one's way lighter than this. But I still see some gap where these colors could have colors in between. And then from here to here, I feel like there should be one more. So I'm pushing it a little more than maybe I was thinking about earlier. And for that, I'd rather have it prepared now than having to do it in the middle of it. So I'm going to take some of this black, move it out of the way just a little bit next to the white over here. Add a little more white. There we go. Here we are. So here's my white, my gray 1, gray 2. Now I'm going to add, again, carefully. I don't want to go too close to the black. I want to be able to, if I'm getting too close, be on the lighter side so I could always add more. You don't want to go too black and begin to add white to lighten that. Make sure you use your paintings effectively. So now you can see these are close. So many techniques that you could bring in. I haven't even mentioned, and I wouldn't dare, but there are so many techniques, and techniques that are developed with tools. Just like you saw me use a paper towel to wipe some of that pigment, and it created this beautiful just opening of light in that background. There are some where you could use masking tape to create sharp edges. You could use, I've seen string, you name it, combs, plastic, kind of these clay tools where you could rub on and just apply the paint with a different technique, creating different textures with different mediums, and combining all of those. It's all about how you unleash your creativity. There's another key word. of the day. Because in the end, it is what you are trying to achieve. A sense of releasing your creative mind, letting it out, adding a little more black. How much? Little by little. Notice the gradation of these grays, and I think that's going to work out really well. So it's going to give me maybe a little too much. It's a little bit far from the just black and white, but I think for what I'm planning to do, it's going to play out really well. And the other thing is I want to make sure I have enough paint of each, so I don't have to come back and remix right in the middle of painting. And a lot of times it's also part of the process. Do I mix as I paint? Do I mix it all first, then paint? Now there are thickening agents. Like this one was more of a liquid agent. Talking about this one here. So there's my colors. This is a liquid agent where you would have a little more drying time is a little longer. It also gets a little more gloss, not much volume. There are vehicles that give you volume, dry faster, textures, all different kinds of things. So finding those out, you might have to, the easiest way sometimes is just visit the art store, the acrylic section, and they have those nice charts that actually show you real physical results of what each medium does. And then remember, you take that and add your own creativity to it, use different tools, different lines, shapes, space, techniques. You're multiplying by infinity. The use of water and other mediums with your water also creates, again, the word infinity of possibilities to add liquidity to it. Washes where it almost becomes the look of watercolor, which is very beautiful. And there's tons of acrylic painters that use that. There's one that's very popular right now where it's pouring and you just let it sit, and kind of like what I did here with water, but it's actually more rainbows of color, marbling it looks like. So this looks dry enough for me to begin painting on top of it. I can actually touch and see that there's a little bit coming off, but it's not gonna really, for the type of brush stroke that I'm gonna use, affect too much. So here are my colors. I'm gonna have them set up right there so you can see what I'm gonna begin doing here. And now, this is really hard for me to explain. How's he doing that? Well, the truth is, it almost becomes kind of a subconscious thing. I don't really have a plan or a map of where I'm going to go. I am reading that word balance, how I'm balancing out brush strokes, volumes, and shapes of color, and the amount of color and contrast as I go along. So I'm really considering all four corners, and that's a great tip. Always consider your four corners. We tend to do everything right here in the center and focus all of it in the center and leave the corners kind of on their own as just, just even part unframed, part of the off frame. You want to somehow consider that. So I am really going to consider bringing in the corners, going to the edges, not just in the middle. Think of that one I showed you with the circle. It goes right to the edges, but the focus is in the center. You want to make different focal points? You can absolutely do that. You want to put more of the focus on the bottom, let the top be more spacious. All these things, again, variables that you can put into play. As far as decision making here, I'm going to grab my flat brush, one of my bigger ones, and I'm going to start with those heavy, pure black brush strokes. Now, I'm loading my brush pretty heavy, as you can see here. And I'm going to make decisions on also playing a part in it is how my background got lighter and darker in certain areas. Now, would it make more sense for me to put this big, heavy blob of black paint, trying to develop a nice brushstroke right in here, in this wider area, or right here in this darker area? So how you make that decision, it's kind of a subconscious thing, but it does make sense when you're analyzing and thinking about it. So I'm going to go obviously for dark on darker. And how I bring that action of putting down this brushstroke is going to be really what I'm focused on. So I'm not thinking of line. I'm not somewhat, yeah, you could actually say shape, but it's more of a shape of a brushstroke. I'm not trying to develop, and it's just really all about, I just thought of it kind of like you were icing a cake, if you can think about that. It just felt like that, like, because I've done that, and it's so much fun where you see some of that cream or whatever it is you use on the cakes as you use a palette knife. Now, again, you can use a brush, or you could use a palette knife, as you see here. And I'm going to do a little bunch of how big, how small are these blobs, and you can see them there. And I'm going to put smaller ones right next to it. How much space in between them? Now remember, I was considering the whole. So do I want just little blotches of black right here? Or do I want to space them out and sort of have a strategy? Now, using the palette knife, I actually am feeling more like that cake icing thing, because it's a little bit more polished. It has that, it doesn't have that brush element to it. So here we go. Let me get this a little close up here. See if that works. So here's one with brush. Notice heavy brush. There's that much paint on it. And as I bring it down here, and I could just dab it on and sort of give it a shape. But it's just literally caking it on, kind of. Smaller one. And as I said earlier, you absolutely want to feel like a little kid, really having fun with color, shape, pigment. Putting one next to the other, playing with the shape. And being able not to have to think of anything in a way. At some point, it should become almost like an automatic, I got to be careful saying that, more of a subconscious event. But as you're thinking through it, you are making decisions of, am I overdoing it here? I always use that metaphor. Many of you probably heard it already. Cooking. So at this point, it's like I'm adding my spices or my salt. You want to be thinking about how much is going to be too much. Let me show you one more. And I've seen many artists do this. They could use the tube and use it right out of the tube. So you have to be very careful with this because you don't want to overdo it either. Like, it only gives you one kind of, and it does obviously apply very heavy. So as I have some of these, I'm really beginning to think a little more of a combination of shapes made by smaller forms of brushstroke. So I want to stay a little bit aware of that. And like I said, not overdo it. Go back to the palette knife and begin to add more. And I'm going to just do pairs of them. Somewhat like pairings or triangular shapes of giving them a little bit of space, maybe coming back for a little extra contrast with the other colors. But I want this to really show up heavy. Here's one more thing I want to show you. So notice this one that I'm going to do here. This is with the palette knife. I'm going to go ahead and put it here. So as I lay it down, notice that it comes, you could see the shape of the palette knife. You could see it slick. But if I go back into it and kind of touch it, I could create, like I said, it's that icing, cake icing thing, where you could create kind of relief, just texture within the texture of the brushstroke. Well, it wasn't a brushstroke, it's a palette knife. But you could see how you can manipulate even the brushstroke. Now, going over them, I'm not sure if I want to do that on every single one. I actually like the look of some of them just being kind of just dropped in. And then just made a little heavier body. But some of them you can scrape up a little. Or pile in together. So here's how it's looking. I'm going to move over to that darker gray. So I'm working my way from black to that darkest gray. See how that looks. And I'm going to do the same thing. So here comes a big moment. Beginning to think about where am I going to put these. So if I put it next to one, it's going to create a nice effect there. And I'm liking that. And it gives me an idea. What if I make choices and not wait all the way to the end, but see how moving from one lighter shade of gray to all the way to white is going to work for me in terms of those patterns that I'm trying to develop. So there you go. And yes, when you put this white right next to that black, oh boy, does it really stand out. So I might want to make those smaller. Have more space. I really enjoy the background, how it came about. Another thing would be considering rotating your canvas, if that is going to help some of the direction of the brush stroke. So you can consider all of the areas, or just to keep your hand out of the way sometimes. Whether there's too much paint over here and you feel like you have to kind of almost lean your hand into it, you might want to just flip it around. And I'm making these brush strokes look very, very similar. So I'm going to play a little more with the length, making some of them smaller. But bulkier. And you see how some of this color is already drying up on my palette. There we go. Go back to the darker gray. And eventually you're going to gain more and more confidence as you begin to recognize your preference on material, use of material, technique, and visual elements. Which are the ones you're going to favor more? Which ones come about and give you that nice, satisfying look in the end? Where you go, oh, wow. Even you wonder, how did I do that? it's becoming more aware. And then doing it more and more. And you develop, by more experimenting, new ways of pushing that. I'm going to flip it around again. Now, moving over to the lighter brush strokes, and I might have to use lots more paint to make this work like I want it to. So that's another decision. Make these a little bulkier. And I might, for the whiter and lighter, I'm going to go back to this brush, but I'm going to go to a smaller brush. So I'm going to go to a smaller round number 4. And I'm going to actually try to begin to give sort of a little gesture to the brush stroke. Kind of like a little circular motion. And it becomes almost just dabbing. And I like a little bit better how it gets smaller and I get to control the actual brushstroke much, much better. Again, taking a little step back. Sometimes a pause is called for. Taking a step back, looking at it. Giving it a good read. Now, this is a compositional thing where you step back 6 to 10 feet away from it. And you can also, very important for composition, you just flip it upside down. Look at it upside down. And then you're going to see if your composition in terms of all the corners coming into play, how it's maintaining balance or not. You can look at it at an angle, 45 degrees, and you do begin to see interesting things about how you're composing, how you're applying balance throughout the entire canvas. Whether you are, or you need to focus a little more on elements in certain areas. That's the only way really to see it. To step away, take a few seconds, and give it a good read. And that's what it is. Just read the saturation, the balance, the contrast. Now I'm going to pure white. So this, I want it to be even smaller, but squarer. So because I'm using a round brush, they're a little rounder. So I want these, as I push the brush down, a little flatter and smaller, because they are going to really demand lots of attention because of the brightness. But I could really build this up, maintaining that space between them, and still have what I had down play a very good part in it. And I think this idea that I had only works if I really pay attention to the space between the brushstroke, the amount of brushstrokes, and having them begin to work together. Very crucial. That color seems way bright, and I do like how that background, the original idea, is coming through. So at this time, I feel that I need to go back into some more black. So I'm going to go back to my small brush. And to balance out the amount of brush strokes that I just put in, it's definitely going to need much more black. And I'm going to use pure black, or maybe just mix a little bit of it with what's on left over on the palette with that white. But I'm going to do it halfway first. So halfway, just pure black. Smaller. These are all going to be smaller dabs of pure black, way smaller than the white, but they're going to be surrounding lots of areas. Now this black, for some reason, it's a lot heavier. It's pastier, thicker. So it's a different brush stroke. But it really plays well off of that background. Plus, because of the acrylic polymer on it, it shines just a little bit. It has a little bit of play of light with it. And my idea was to saturate, wanting to get lots of brush strokes playing off of each other. So some of the space in between, and letting the background do what it's supposed to, it's still crucial. But at any moment, when I said about stepping back, you don't want to go too far where you can't come back from it. So I'm paying attention to that. Now for some of these approaches, some of you may have been done 30 minutes ago, because it could be just a swoosh, black on white type of gesture. And that's fine. That's actually a great way of working if you can capture it in just one stroke. Eventually, you're going to want to get to practice some of that. Let me get a couple more over here on this area. So these dabs of paint, let me see what they look like over here. So as you can see, I'm just placing them all over. And the way it's reading with the background, I, in a way, kind of am second guessing that pure white decision. And it's fine. I'll live with it. Learn from it. It is high contrast. And it might be because I had this idea as I was talking through it of just black on black. And for some reason that seemed appealing, interesting to me. The idea of creating variation of saturation, space, balance with just black paint on a black background, which is very doable. And like many things, don't think it's been done. It's already done. Yes, lots of things have been already done, but there's only one way for you to do it, and it's the way you do it. Not everything has been done. Even if you were to take inspiration from some of the samples I showed, it's going to be still 100% the way you would do it. As far as bringing up the idea and having it all the way through resolution, the only way is to do more and more of this type of practice. Sit down, set up some paint, have a clear general idea, of the elements that you want to play with, line, shapes, what limitations in terms of color, and allow yourself to just play. So I'm going to do something very risky here. I'm going to add a little black on top of one of the whites. Ooh, I like that. So I just developed something else just to create even more play. Risky, but it is bothering me a little with that high contrast. So here's what I did. I took some pure black and I just dabbed it right in the middle of those. Remix it. So now there's a little white space between that earlier brush stroke, as you can see it here, especially on those extra bright spots. And I'm not sure if I'm going to want to do this in every single one. Got to be careful, move around, maybe do it in a few here and there. But it automatically does something to it, as you can see. And making a selection on where to do that is now another element of it. How do you choose? Well, you look at the way it's balancing out, the way it's arranged. And it gives you all the clues. Okay, I'm going right into that white to make this a little bit darker. Here you go, so you can see. Use all of that white. I'm going to use the palette knife to just scoop it up a little as it's drying. Mix it up again. And this one's getting, because it's getting drier, it's getting a little bit thicker. So it's going to give me another new interesting texture. Very interesting texture here. And I'm going to use that just to help balance out some of those lighter areas. Now I might have gone in a completely different direction, but I could see this with more time becoming kind of what I was looking for. So I'm going to let that white paint dry, and I could still come over it again with just a little wash of maybe a little heavier, darker gray. I think that's what's not doing it for me. And that's the beauty of acrylic. You, in the moment, can work it, and if it dries and allows you, and you have a strategy, a plan, you can always come back a dry area and rework it. Not necessarily like you would intend, meaning it's not going to just give in. It's going to stay as it is, but it could give you that translucency. So notice here, for example, if I grab a little more water and some of this looser black here, notice how as I add water, it really gets washy here. And I could bring it in, and on the previous layer, it's going to give me just another, like a glaze of transparency. And I could do that as well and bring it even on top. And too many of these are still too wet because they're so thick, but it could do it even on top of acrylic. So you can see how that would work. But definitely going to need lots and lots more brush stroke, lots more paint to build up that contrast that I was looking for, that texture. Maybe also the brush strokes needed to be bigger. I made them maybe too small, too many too small. So maybe bigger, thicker And that obviously is going to be a lot more paint, but that's how you go about it. So for that, I would definitely recommend a thickening agent, which makes it a little cheaper, easier, more viable for you to build up body into the paint, texture into the paint, and not have to use so much pigment.